So the next thing we're going to do now is we are going to add a reference to the libraries we need to work with in this presentation. So to do that, I'll come here and add a reference, a project reference. So add a existing project. Let me just add the projects here so it can be easy. And the very first one is TCS Accounting Business Logic. That is the very first project I want to add. The next project I will add to this solution, not new project, apologies. Sorry, I'll cancel this and come add existing project. And the next one I will add is the infrastructure, because I want to make use or take advantage of entity framework implementation that the entity framework implementation we actually developed in the infrastructure. So to do this, we've had the two projects I need to add references to this project. So I'll add project reference to TCS and both projects, all right, to the business logic and the infrastructure. Now we've done that, and we can go ahead and minimize this. I don't have need for it now. Authorize the error. We will have a look at it and resolve it. So we have this form now, and we can double click on this form to go to the code behind file. So let's just do that, and that will take us to the code behind file. All right, so the very first thing we will do is I will define a business data object, and I'll call it business info. And that is what I will do. So here I would actually like to import this, because this is inside business logic. And if you notice that if you come to business here, we have the business data object here, and that is what I want to have access to. So we can go ahead and inject this into a service that can actually get the business data object for us, or we can pass in the business data object into the constructor there and have that implemented for us. So we can go in and say business data object, and here we can business data like that, and we can have this implementation like this, and that is all we need to do. Then we can, while the form is loading, because this on form load is actually an event, so we can come in here and do some very simple mapping. So we can say this text business name, all right, equals to just the text, equals to, equals to business info business name. That is one. We can say that this text address, let's do that, text property equals to business info dot text address, dot address, and this is actually one way of actually binding objects to your controls, to your presentation. So this is my presentation, and behind it I'm actually getting information and binding them. Another way of actually binding objects to this is using what we call a data component called binding source. So we can actually get an object, inject into the binding source, and bind the components in, and bind the controls to the binding source. And we will get to see how that is implemented. And that is one thing. Another thing I've wanted you to take note is that you should notice that we are using sender and event arguments here. So this should tell you that we are the Windows Form application actually utilizes the event-driven delegate implementation, like, because we are binding events, you're subscribing to events and actions are being taken. So that's one thing I also want you to actually envisage and understand. That is what is happening here. So when the form load event fires, this gets executed, we actually bind the text information of these controls to what we have in memory in this business information. All right, that's what we're doing. So the next thing I would like us to bind to is text email. I think so. That should be there. And business info dot email. Let's duplicate this more. Dot email like that. Let's just come in here and put email. And the next one should be phone. If I'm not mistaken, we should have phone. And we can come in here and just say text phone. And just put text phone. The tags, and another thing we should do in addition to that should be I think we've done that, is a counting method, right? So a counting method here is actually an integer. So here will be this .cmb counting method. And there is a problem here. I would refactor this and show you the proper implementation of what we can do to set that property properly. So that being said, when we call this form, something should happen. We should actually be able to bind this object to it, all right? And that means we're going to utilize so many things in our application. Let's come back to our form shell and notice that this is where we actually, you can have access to the form. And here we need to actually pass in a business data, because assuming the use case is that only one business can use TCS accounting. All right, assuming that that's the use case, it means that at every point in time the system loads, we should have the business information printed out. And to do that, we need to grab the business information from the database and bring it to the system. All right, and that is one of the things we need to do. All right, so let's go ahead and okay, so we have custom init. All right, so we created let's go ahead and bootstrap that functionality. Now, what we will normally do is that we have a business service. I'll show you this. So here, I can come inside this form shell and say iBusiness service, like this, and say business service. Here, I can do this, but by virtue right, we should use dependency injection to pass and inject the service. But we'll do that. So while we will do that, we can actually do some hack, like business service is equals to new business service. Since we have a concrete implementation, I just want to show you this first. Business service before we hit to use dependency injection. And we have this business service. But there is another problem. We need a business service repository. And for us to use business service, we need to hook in the business service repository. I don't need to do this if you listen to how if you watch the series on how we wrote the test cases. And if I were to do that, I would, if this is not a test, this is an actual application, a prototype of an application. So let's go ahead, and because this chain begins to build, once we supply the business repository, we will now need to provide some form of injection for the unit of work that this business repository actually relies on. And that will complicate the process. So let's go ahead and implement dependency injection in this Windows Form application all at once. So the very first place to do is let's come to the program.cs file, which is the entry point of our application. So the program.cs file is where everything starts in Windows Form application. And we have this class program, and we have this application configuration.initialize, and we have the application.run, and you notice the very first form that gets injected is the form shell. And that is what starts the entire process. So let's this is where we start. This is where we would actually wrap up our host and configure a container that our application can use. So to actually do that, we need to have to actually bringing dependency injection into the Windows Phone application, we need two libraries. All right. The very first one we are going to add to our project is we need to come to NuGet Package Manager. We need to get to NuGet Package Manager, and we need to search for these two libraries as Microsoft Extensions to Hosting. That is the very first one, and here is it, and we need to install it. And the next one we also need is the abstractions library, hosting abstractions, this one here, so we can go ahead and install them. So we have both libraries in here, so then we have both packages in our Windows Phone application. So to have access to this, we can go ahead and do a static, you can create a static iHost builder, create host builder. And here we can go ahead and return host, call the host here, host to create default builder, and services, because and here we can pass in this text in, if you notice carefully, this host builder takes in a delegate that takes in a service collection, and also a building context. All right, so here we can pass in context and pass in services, and basically this is a lambda expression, and we can wrap all our functions and our services inside this host, and basically that's what we need to do. So we can come in here, and we have some services already that we want to take advantage of. So we can come and say services dot add. The very first one I want us to add is TCS accounting application. Remember that? And that is the very first service I want us to add. The next service I want us to add is services dot TCS dot add TCS infrastructure, EF core infrastructure. That gives us the ability to have our services configured for utilization. So how do we actually, then the next thing I think we should actually do is we can come in here and say services dot add, let me just say add transient, we can say not start, we can do form shell. All right, so, and we can just add one instance of that, and that is good enough. And basically that is what we want. This is what we want. So here we can comment this out, line of code, and we can come in here and say var host equals to create host builder, or create host builder dot build. I'm calling the build method, and if you notice vividly, the build method will actually return will initialize and give us a host. All right, and that is basically what it does. It initializes and gives us a host, and we can now use the host to power our applications. So we can, before we actually do that, we can say for service provider. You should know this if you've been following on in this learning series. You would know what we mean by service provider when we're building the API, the service endpoint, RESTful service endpoint for TCS accountant. So we can use that and say host services to get required service, not required. This time we would say host services, host.services, just that. and that is what we need. And the next thing we will do is we'll call application dot run, and here we'll use the service provider and get required service, and here we will pass in form shell and give us the instance of that form that you have, and that is what we need to do. All right, that's one way we have injected dependency injection into our application. So we have dependency injection configured in our application. Let's actually test this out and see how it works. Let's go ahead and test this out and run the application. We will have an error. I just remembered something, because we have a form here that has this injected, and this is not going to work, and except we provide this information before now and have it in memory. So how can we do that? How do we instantiate this form? Because this property will be required. So let's come to our form shell, and remember that we needed business service. So instead of doing this, we can go ahead and actually use DI in our application. All right, so we have DI now, so that should resolve and give us what business service we should use. All right, so let's go ahead and grab an instance of this and put it in here, and here we can call it business service like this, and here we can here we need to actually inject this inside. So we can go ahead and actually do the injection here, and we can instantiate business service equals to like this, equals to business service. All right, we can go ahead and do this, and for now let's just comment this out. Let's make sure that our form is actually working properly. And we have that in place now. So the next thing we will do is, I think this is good. Let's go ahead and run this and see what we get. So we get an error, unable to resolve service for TCS DB context. All right, I forgot that. So let's stop this now and come back to our host service. And here we can actually do something like services dot DB context. Remember what we did in DB context. Here we can say TCS DB context, and here we need to pass in some form of configuration that the TCS DB context will actually use. If you followed the rest of the series, what we implemented, for instance, let me show you that. Alright, for instance, in the REST API, let's come to here. You notice that we had services.addDB context. We just did usequal, and we pass in a connection string. Remember when we did this when we were developing the API for our application. So I think basically let's just copy this convention, and we'll pass in options and use SQL Server. You should understand that by now. Alright, so here we'll come back to our application and add DB context. And before we actually do that, we should have some place we have a connection string specified. So we can inject this here, and here we can say, because we need to have access to the connection resource here, this is going to be static string like that, and instead of coming in with builder dot configuration, we can actually have access to the configuration here. All right, so right now we need to configure the connection string for our TCS DB context so we can actually inject it properly. So the very basic thing we should go ahead and do is let's use a tried and trusted way of integrating configuration in Windows Phone application, and that is using the application config file called appconfig, and that is what we need. So we'll add the appconfig file here, and we will come in here and add a connection string property connection strings. I think so. That is it. Alright, I'm correct. In here we'll call the add method. Here we'll call the name. We'll give the connection string a name, and we'll call it app connection. And we'll put in the connection string property, which is connection string, and we can use the property. So typically we could use the SQL Server. So what we will indeed do is we'll just come over to what we had in our application, in TCS accounting application, the same thing we use for testing the API, the RESTful endpoint. We'll just go ahead and copy that and come in here and inject it in here as our connection string. And that's the simple thing we will do. And we'll use the same resource, and that is all we need to do. So the next thing we need to do is we need to see a way of programmatically. So we've got this already, app connection, and we can come to use SQL Server, options.use SQL Server. You should be familiar with this by now. It's SQL Server, and here we pass in the DB connection string. And that is basically what we need to do here. And we need to install SQL as usual. We don't have SQL, so you can come in here under dependencies and add a NuGet package manager. In this time, we will add Microsoft.Entity Framework. Not Entity Framework Core per se. All we need is Entity Framework SQL Server, just that. And we can go ahead and add that to our application. So we add SQL Server, that is done, and we can come back to our program.cs file, and we can add a reference to this. We can add a reference to using SQL, Microsoft SQL Server, and that's all we need to do. So we can come back to our app.config file and check this out. This is not, this should be this way, and let's we have that configured already. And we this has to terminate properly, and we have injected our connection string into the application, and that is basically what we need to do to get our connection string available. And that's what we need to bring in SQL Server into the presentation, the Windows Form application presentation. And I think we're all good. I think that this is fair enough. Let me check out something. And by the way, I would like to actually test the fact that we can actually get data from the server. And to do that, I would like if you check out our app config, we are actually connecting to the data store that we've been using for testing, for the integration testing, and for building the API, which we did. So let's come back here and actually do something. Let's come to the form shell, and the form shell have access to the business. Let's get the default business and actually bind this to the default business and see what it is. So we can come in here and actually let's do this. Okay, let's make sure that we actually can connect to the business and get the default business information out this time. So to do that, I would like us to come into the custom init here and say for our business info, no way, let's do this. Let's have one business information always available. So we can say, so we should have a global business information we can use in our application. So here we can say business data object, and we can say business info. Let's use the word business info like that. And while this form is loading, here we can make this actually let's make this a nullable type, for instance, or nothing. It could be nothing. Let's make this a nullable type because I want this to be instantiated later. So here we can actually say this dot business info equals to, just use the business service and go inside and get the default business like that. and we should be able to get the default business in here. And what I want is I want that to be appended into the title of this form. So if we let's check out something. Let's go to the property of the form. Not this one. On the shell, we should notice that we had this hard-coded here. Alright, and if you come to the properties here, you will notice that we had coded this information into this application. So I would want to do something else. So despite that being hard-coded there, I want us to be able to do something else. Here I want to change, perform some form of this dot text equals to string.format. No need for us to use string.format. In this case, we can actually use this and pass in that argument and pass in that value, sorry, and use the string interpolation, and we can go ahead and add another feature. Let's do this. Let's do this in here. And so here we can see business info. Let's just say business info dot here we can grab the business name and pass in the object like that. Alright, and this depends if this is not null, so this should actually only work if that is not null. Alright, so if not, so that should still return the property. So we could say if this is not business info is not null, go ahead and do that particular configuration. Alright, let's separate this so that this are actually two different type of information. Alright, so go ahead and run that. Let's go test that out if we can actually get the default business with that configuration we had. Alright, so a connection successfully established. We cannot connect to the, alright, so this means this is, alright, we can connect to the database, but the database is not allowing us to have access to it. Let's just please let's modify our configuration. I do not do this in production. This is actually done for actually, let's get the this is just done for testing or demo purpose. So we'll set encrypt. Let's set the encrypt to false. Right, let's set that to false, and that should allow us to have access to this, to the server. Alright, so we can, okay, we have access to the server now. So updated Thompson Limited, and that is very good. So this is functioning. Our dependency injection is functioning. We've configured a host for the Windows Form application or Windows Form presentation, and we've accessed our database, and we've gotten information out from the database, and actually we can have access to the database from the application. Right, so let's go ahead and do more things to this application. Alright, so we have created a host builder. We did a configuration. We grabbed the service provider, and we use the service provider to instantiate a new shell of our application and run it inside the application node run. And this was the service provider which had access to our application, TCS accounting application dependency. We also did that for TCS accounting entity framework core infrastructure, which we have implemented. We hooked DB context, a DB context instance of a DB context that our application can use and connect to the database, and we added a transient. Add transients means that each time we request for this object to give us a fresh and a new copy of it, and that's what we actually did in our application. So the next thing we should do now is we have a business form here, this form here, and we did try to map the properties of this form to an object here which we provided, and this object is a single object that always exists, and which they should be aware of us trying to inject this object into our application, or probably call a service that gives us the default business, as the case may be. just like we have it inside the form shell, where we have this instantiated and we call default business. We assign the value to it here. We can actually do the same thing in our application. We can have the business, we can have the default business, and have the property of the form injected into it. But however, we already have this in here, and let's comment this out. Let me show you something. We have the business form here, and we have an instance of this business info, but you cannot tell whether this actually is this is actually nullable. We cannot tell whether the business information has been created or it has not been created. So it is not actually, I would have said we should come into our program.cs file and actually bootstrap a functionality that can give us the default business, and we use that to bootstrap this service. All right, or we can create a service that gives us the default business, as the case may be. So let's, however, I'm thinking we should, instead of injecting this, we can actually inject a service. Like we can remove this here instead of doing that, and actually inject a service like iBusiness service, and then we can go ahead and inject that service into this constructor like that, and we can assign the value here. And after doing that, let's call dependency injection to do that first before we initiate some of the properties. After doing that, I would like us to grab the default business here, so we can go inside and say business info dot get default business, or no, sorry, business service dot get default business, and that should give us an instance of the default business if it is there, and a possible null reference. We're very sure that this actually is not null because we're actually giving it a value here, so I'm pretty sure that wouldn't be null, so I can go ahead and escape that. I'm coming. How are we sure that we do not have this, that this business is not null? So I think we can go ahead and put this, and that can be null. Let's leave it, that can be null, because this actually returns a business data object that is null, and we cannot tell whether it is not null. So at runtime, and that is what, and we would actually bind this to here. So before we actually do that, we should actually check that if business info is not null, business info is not null. All right, so doing that, we can go ahead and initialize the values or set the properties as false. So let's do that practically and see what we get in here. Before doing that, we should come to our shell here, and actually we instantiate a new business form, and this is wrong because this is an instance. We should not do it this way. We should use our service provider to do that. So one way we can go about doing that is to get the instance of the service provider and actually inject this form for us into this parent. That's one way we can do that. So to do that, we need a way to grab an instance of that application. So first, let's come back to program, and this is a program.cs file, and we have the service provider, which is always active. Let's remove this. I don't need this here, and let's go ahead and do this. We cannot access this functionality here, but we can do something else. So we can come in here, we can build a static property for this application, and we'll call it service provider, iService provider. Let's do that, iService provider, and we can call it service provider. Let's keep it service provider. And here we can make this a property, and we can give it a private accessor like that, and this needs to be assigned a value, most definitely. All right, and how do we do that? So here we can actually change this to be service provider, and then I have access to here and here. Once we call the main method, we can assign the value to it. Why is it 1 second? All right, so here we need to set this as public. All right, first and foremost. And here we can assign the value private. We can actually instantiate this to equals to default if there is anything like that. And that should obviously, yeah, default, and that is enough. That should solve that. And default service provider. And that's good enough. So we can hook the service provider in here and so that we can have access to it. All right. So in doing this, we can come inside our form here and also add a services dot add transient. Let's put a transient, and we can say form business info like that. And once that is done, we can come into our shell, and instead of having a new instance of this form this way, we can go up and say program. I think that it's what program, yeah, dot ca service provider. Now the service provider here and the program here is this file, this program here. That's what I'm calling, and this is the service provider I am actually calling, the one here. All right, and so we can go ahead and do that. A service provider dot get required service, and what we need is instance of a form business info. And once you grab us an instance of that, hook it into this MDI parent and show us that form. That's simple. So we run our application and actually have a good look at it. And let's see what this is and what we get. So we have this form in here, and we have business information. So let's load the business information. All right, voila. So you notice that we're able to grab what server we had in the database, and we're able to bind it to this particular form. And this is what we had in the database that we used in doing the integration testing. All right, so it means our dependency injection is actually working very well, and we are actually connecting to the database to get information. All right, so let's make this application a bit better, and let's go ahead and do that now. So that being said and that being done, let's go ahead and actually add more configurations to this business info. Now the property we didn't configure is the, all right,